Well, good evening, and thank you, Linnell, for that very warm introduction, and thanks to you all for having me here. And I think just make two observations initially. The first is someone said the closest any of us gets to perfection is when your CV is read out, because what your CV does is it always highlights the peaks, but never really the troughs or the difficulties in one's career. The second observation is I'll make is, and it's always in hindsight, when I look back at my career and what I've done, there's certain things that are a common thread, the desire to be in situations where you can make impact at scale, and the desire to do that by being entrepreneurial in terms of approach and how you think about things. And that's really been the common thread ever since I did at the time, the rather obvious thing after Oxford, going to join an investment bank. But I had come over from Ghana, as Lionel said, got into Oxford, and I worked out the fastest way to pay off debts was to go and join an investment bank, and then after that, work out what to do next. And I was always very conscious when I was doing that. I didn't want to be one of those people that joined thinking, I'll do this to pay off my debts, and then 20 years later, I was still there. And I wanted to be someone who made decisions and got involved in things. And that's what I've done. And when Lionel and I first met, it was after I had left Parliament, not planned. I had voted against Boris Johnson's No Deal Brexit and been expelled from the Conservative Party at the time. And something that my wife finds amusing, because later on when I had to fill my form for the Goldman Sachs board, which I joined, and the Bank of England requires you to fill in a form because have you ever been sacked for gross misconduct? And I put no, and my wife looked over my shoulder and said, didn't Boris kick you out of the Conservative Party? You should put that there. And but anyway, I can go into that in detail if people want to know. But it was then that I met Lionel after my time in politics, wanting to continue in what I had started in politics in something that was in the innovation space where you can make impact at scale. And Oxford University is unique amongst global universities in being able to develop world-changing science into ventures that then go on to make huge impact. And that's when we met, and it's been, a lot has happened since then. But I think before I dive into where I am now, I think there was a little video that I was going to show just to set the scene. If you want to understand the world of investment today, you need to understand both politics and business. And that is what this podcast is all about.
Very fundamentally, we have a growth problem around the world.
From stateroom to boardroom, I'm bringing together thinkers and decision makers who can help us understand what is happening and where the world is going.
I think what we're living through at the moment is the sharpest change in geopolitics that I've seen in my lifetime.
People who've been in the room when big decisions are taken, and visionaries who want to change the world.
I just wanted to be able to take out my phone and it should tell me, today you cannot get pregnant, or today you can get pregnant.
From Wall Street to Downing Street, I've got a unique perspective, and now I'm sharing that with you.
Let's work all together. All together. We need to have this amazing dialogue to bring prosperity.
Subscribe to the Geopolitics of Business on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So my first answer that you subscribe to my podcast. But the reason for that is one of the things I left politics with is a desire to be able to translate what I saw was happening in politics into the world of business. And as an interdisciplinary college, I'm sure that those of you here at Rubin would appreciate the benefits that come from looking at problems from multiple perspectives. And in 2020, I went to a private equity firm in New York and offered my services to them. And one of the largest ones, I said, I really understand government. I was in Goldman, I understand government. I think I can help you with your deals. To which the reply was, Sam, government is like having a pebble in your shoe on a busy day. It's incredibly irritating, but if you're really busy, you can't stop to get rid of it. So thank you for your offer, but we actually try to stay away from government. This was in 2020. But I would say that since 2020, the world has moved on a lot in terms of how politics is impacting business in a way when business or the economics used to drive the politics. And the reasons for that and why politics, or let's say geopolitics, matters is that suddenly nations woke up and began to think globalization is not really working for them, not working for them as they wanted it to. And so we began to see fragmentation, which is a recurring theme in the discussions that we have on the podcast. And by fragmentation, you began to see this during the pandemic. Suddenly the Chinese had their vaccine and they were going to stick with that. I don't think the Americans ever gave approval to the Oxford vaccine because it wasn't American. And yet, Moderna, etc., which were developed in America, were pushed really hard. And we just thought that kind of nationalism was just a feature of the pandemic. But then we came out of the pandemic and we began to see that fragmentation and protectionism that came with it was beginning to seep into many other industries. But it wasn't just fragmentation. We also began to see that governments were now very keen to shape markets through industrial policy, export controls, and strategic subsidies. Now, I remember when I was a science minister, during the Brexit negotiations, I was responsible for space as one of the areas. And the UK had a lot of space interests, a number of space interests, notably Galileo, which is Europe's version of GPS. And someone had got really concerned, quite rightly, that given that the Americans control GPS, they could one day just turn it off. GPS now is used for maritime, it's used for military operations, it's using our mobile phones, and that would be a seismic case if that happened. So it was in Europe's interest to develop its own version of GPS. And during the negotiations, it was my job to advocate for British industrial interests with the EU so that we could still carry on, our industry could still carry on developing the technology for Galileo, the satellite system, even though we're out of the EU. The message I got from the EU was, well, you're now a third country, so those British companies would have to move to the EU if they want to win EU contracts. And I went to the US to see whether we could do a deal with the US for those British companies. And in the lift at the White House, I met someone who was responsible for intellectual property. And I thought, why is the guy responsible for intellectual property based in the security department? This is during Trump 1.0. And it was only subsequently that I realized what is now very much a case, that the US had begun to see areas that he wanted to protect economically as part of its security policy. And that has accelerated under Trump 2.0. And so for a lot of entrepreneurs now, they operate in a world where political decisions are baked into whether or not they can get their product out. We've been acting recently in my business. We advise and we co-invest in companies touched by politics. A company that to raise capital, it couldn't raise capital it had to raise capital purely from British sources. Now, that wasn't the case 10 years ago. The idea that some capital is good, other capital not so good if you are a strategic industry. So the features of what I see now in my world of work, but also that we discuss on this podcast repeatedly, is technological competition, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum, whether it's semiconductors. In every one of these areas, governments now have a strategic interest. And so if you are an entrepreneur or a business person acting, you do not have the free hand that you thought you had. You've also got, that is also supported by industrial policy. We've seen the CHIPS Act in the US, before that the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got EU industrial strategy. So what you've got is you've got the state really trying to reshape and make the economic landscape in a way that if you were to go back 10, 15 years ago, it was free market. Ideas were global, capital was global, people were global. But now what we're having is boundaries being put in place and limitations being put in place, being implemented by governments in order to protect themselves. Ostensibly, sometimes for security reasons, sometimes to protect against cyber. But what this means is that the business landscape has changed immensely. And not only has the business landscape changed, this now permeates every industry. Because it's very easy for people to say when I started advocating this, and I remember, I invited Jose Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission, was my first guest. And I had to, on the podcast, and I had to write a very long essay as to why I thought politics was trumping business. Because we're used to regulatory frameworks for the utility sector, for the financial services sector. But now in defense and aerospace, whether it's dual-use technologies, whether it's biotechnology, digital infrastructure, data, our supply chains, agriculture, food. So in every part of the economy now, it is very difficult to invest, to grow a business, without being in a situation where policy doesn't impact your ability to develop your product, do a deal, the value of your company, and your ability to maximize that value in any one country or another. So if you're an entrepreneur, political risk is now a core business risk. Your supply chain strategy has to align with geopolitical realities. As I've said, capital comes with a flag. The investor origin determines market access. If your source of your capital is Chinese, you probably wouldn't get approval for a strategic business in the UK now. When I was in David Cameron's government, they couldn't help themselves. We were all going to China to try to get business. That's how much the world has changed in 10, 15 years. And universities are also geopolitical actors, whether it's the talent to come and study and to do research here. I remember when I was a university's minister, one of the things I always marveled at was that whenever you went into places of research, what distinguished them was how international they were and the cross-fertilization that happened. But we're now in a situation where, to my disappointment, visa policies, immigration policies seem to be turning the clock back or undermining the very environment that you need to foster great research and ideas coming together. Frontier research, the kind that Lionel is involved in, is coming under increasing scrutiny. And it's not enough to be a researcher or an innovator. You have to anticipate where the politics is going. So what is the framework for you if you are a researcher or an innovator? I think you have to map your geopolitical exposure, sadly. You have to integrate political strategy into whatever your corporate strategy is. Where are you going to locate? Who are you going to hire? Whose capital are you going to take? All of these now come with a political tinge. And you've got to choose your partners wisely, whether it's a government, a university, a sovereign investor, or even a corporate. And then you've got to ride the tailwinds, because what is different now is, compared to, say, the Cold War, is it's not really clear where each side is, kind of what's good, what's bad, where you are. What you've got is, we say that it's nations trying to work out where their interests are and really bargaining and changing their positions. So one country could be an ally today, but not an ally tomorrow, or an ally on one issue, but not on another issue. And this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we face now. Whether it's technology development, whether it's critical minerals, you pick your sector, that we now are in a world where structurally nations are acting in their own self-interest. in a way that doesn't always support great research, great innovation, or great ideas unless it is aligned with a national flag. And we need to work out very quickly how we operate in this new paradigm. What I've learned since leaving government and being in the world of capital is business people will just do what business people have to do. They'll work out what's practical. They'll find a way to do business. But we still need guardrails. We need a framework. We need a way to think about how the world should operate. And I believe that that challenge is one that is best resolved at places like Rubin College. Certainly not from the point of business, because business would always do what is immediately in its interest. And that is the challenge that I have for you today. And I was to leave you with one question for us to certainly discuss today is, how do we avoid a splinternet? A world where you have the Chinese internet and the American internet, and we have to choose. And a lot will flow from that, because whether it's data, whether it's security, whether it's cyber, whether the direction of AI, all of these will flow from that. And at the moment, in this sort of huge tussle between the US and China, there is a danger that middle countries just don't have a choice and have to choose one, don't have a choice of their own, but end up by default falling into one camp or another. And I don't think that will be a peaceful, stable world if that's where we ended up. So that's the question that I would leave you with today, and I'll be delighted to discuss alongside any other questions that you have. Thank you.